Welcome to Shift, a college admissions ACT, SAT, and CLT podcast for a changing world. I'm Tyler, the founder of Achievable, and we have an affordable ACT course that includes everything you need to ace your ACT. A full textbook, tons of ACT questions backed by our memory enhancing algorithm, videos on key topics, a built-in study planner, and full-length practice exams. You can get a free trial at achievable.me, and if you like it, use the code podcast to get 10% off at checkout. Now, let's get started. So today we've got David Parker from Parker Educational Consulting with us. And David, I'd love if you can introduce yourself and your company.
Absolutely. My name's David Parker. I was an English professor for 20 years. That's most of my background. I've got a PhD from Chapel Hill. And about 5 years ago, I left that to start this and really love doing it. Since I worked with student writing for so long, working with the essays is my favorite part, and we have a lot of success with it.
Yeah, fantastic. So today we're going to be talking about what are kind of like the biggest trends college admissions going into the second half of 2024. We sit here in June of 2024, making these predictions here. But let's start talking with the big one, right? The one that I think you wanted to talk about first was the move towards conditional admissions, which I've actually never really been that familiar with. So I'm quite curious about this.
It's a little bit, it's not completely new. There are universities who have done one version of these or other at almost all times. But what I'm seeing it more and more as a trend. And what I'm seeing is one of a couple of things. One is they're trying to keep as many of the seats full as they can in college, and they know there's going to be some breakage. And by breakage, I mean that after the first semester, some students are going to leave. They're going to not do well academically, or they're going to be homesick, or they're going to be financial issues. And so this leaves some empty beds in the dorms, and universities abhor a vacuum. So they want to find a way to fill those holes as early as possible, hopefully by the spring semester. So the
Right.
two things that I'm sorry. Oh, you were just agreeing. So the
Yeah, I
two
was just
things.
agreeing with you.
Oh, thank you. So the two things that I've seen, one that I've seen for a while is you can't come fall semester, but you can come spring semester. So this is really, I think, candidates who very much are on the edge of getting in. And the school knows that they could do the work academically, but they don't have the space for them. And so they're counting on, you know, 3 to 5% of their freshmen perhaps dropping out. And then they have these
Right.
students who are ready to go in the spring. I have a client who's doing that this year with University of Miami. She couldn't be happier. I mean, she's going to take a couple of community college classes, after checking to make sure that they'll transfer. She's going to earn some money. And University of Miami is an expensive place to to go to school, and so
Right.
that's going to work out really well for her. The other version of this that I see maybe even more commonly is that you can take your first semester in a study abroad program. Uh, Duke has done this for a long time. Come to our campus, in China, or our campus in Rome, for the first semester. So once again, you're not taking up freshman beds on the traditional campus. And then in the spring,
Mhm.
some of these dropouts will have happened, and so they'll have room for you. And that one is especially good because it does give the student a chance to, first of all, take a foreign study program, which I think is great. I think that's one of the best things you can do for yourself in college, but also just a chance to get to know college level work and see how you are at it and kind of get some experience under your belt before you hit the main campus. So those two, and I
Yeah.
said those are both sort of, you can show up after fall semester because they know they're going to lose some students. The other thing that I'm
Huh.
starting to see a lot more of this year is, you can come, but you have to spend the first 2 years at a satellite campus. I
Mhm.
ran into this in several cases this year with Pitt, University of Pittsburgh, and they offered a couple of my clients the first 2 years at the UPitt Bradford, which is, it's fine, but it's not the regular UPitt campus. And then the last two
Right.
years on the main campus. So again, they're sort of counting on the fact that not everybody's going to return every semester after their first. There's going to be some space on campus by the student's junior year, and they'll be able to fill it then.
Yeah, that's a really interesting trend. I actually I really like am curious about this because I think on the one hand, when you first started talking about it and started talking about how, oh, every school expects people to drop out or things like that, uh, my assumption was that basically that this wouldn't apply to like top tier schools because they have less dropouts. And like, I think it's interesting that, Pitt and Miami are actually like, those are great universities, right? Nationally recognized universities, and Duke, obviously. And they've all been doing this for a while. So it seems like
Yeah,
this is sort of a common practice up and down the sort of the hierarchy of colleges.
it really is. And in some ways, maybe even more with the top tier colleges. I was trying to remember, I think it's Boston College is also pretty prevalent in doing this. I think that with the really big school, let's say University of Michigan, well, or even University of Missouri, say, they're going to have a lower retention rate than an Ivy League type school, for
Mhm.
example, as you mentioned. But I think that I don't think they're as, because of just volume, I don't think they're as desperate to fill a few spots in a spring semester as much as say a small liberal arts college that's only got 1,000 freshmen. Say, if you
Right.
lose 15 or 20, that's a hit on your income. And also the fact that private schools in a lot of cases are mostly tuition driven, so they can't go to the state and sort of say, hey, we had a shortfall, can you spot us a few bucks?
Right. Right. That's really interesting. And I mean, it sounds like this is a good option if you have your heart set on a school. But I also, I would be worried personally if it was my kid that like they maybe wouldn't get that sort of freshman first semester experience because they're in a different place. Do your clients run into any trouble with that or not really?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I mean, I think that that first semester on campus is really important. I, nobody's nobody's asking me, but I would almost prefer for them to take a whole year off. So they come in with a
Right.
cohort, because spring semester, very few students are new. So you're not sharing that
Hmm.
sort of confusion and exploration with anybody else. But for the most
Right.
part, it
And
is a
it's
good
also like
option.
all the friend groups are already established and you're kind of like coming in
Yeah,
late.
right,
But
right. If you
yeah, it
think
is
of,
an interesting option though.
yeah, and it's it's one of those things. I've had, I said my client who's going to Miami is really thrilled with it. On the other hand, like I said, I had a client who was offered the UPitt Bradford campus that was going to be 2 entire years, and we opted away from that. And he's going to Michigan
Yeah.
State on just a regular admission.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. So it just depends on the person, but it's interesting option and it's certainly a trend. So thank you for sharing that one. I mean,
Yeah,
the next trend
absolutely.
is directly related to admissions too, right? Which is talking about direct admissions to programs. And I'm curious,
Yeah.
what is just get for people who haven't heard it before, can you explain direct admissions real quick?
Right. So direct admission means that you have to apply directly to the major or the school that you're going to be a part of. And so typically it's going to be most engineering programs are like this. A lot of computer science and computer engineering programs are like this. And then sometimes it's things you might be surprised at, like music, because music, they want to make sure that you have an audition, that you've got the musical chops to be the person that they want. So that happens a lot. And so what happens, and it's, I don't want to say it's new, but it's not terribly old. And in working this
Hmm.
job, what I run into is the parents applied to college in the 80s or 90s. And anything about admissions that's happened in the past 20 years, they probably don't know, or they know it
Right.
from from their peers or from other people's kids or nieces and nephews and things like that. So when I say that this, direct admissions thing is a little bit new, I don't think it's that new, but it's newer than a lot of parents remember. They just remember you apply to college, you get in, and then you declare a major. And it's
Mhm.
it's just not that way for some of these majors anymore. So computer science is, I'll use that as my example because that's really the most popular, field right now. I don't even want to call it a major because there's several majors, that are covered under that umbrella. But so, for
Right.
example, at Carnegie Mellon University, computer
Yep.
science acceptance rate is about 3% versus 15% for the overall school. So
Mhm.
you have a 5-time multiplier, or you're 5 times less likely to
Right.
get into the computer science. University of Washington, which is a great computer science program for out of state students, the admission rate is 33% for everybody, but only 3% for computer science. So, if you come out of your high school career, you say, I've got this great GPA, I've got these good standardized test scores, I've got lots of activities. And so here's a school with a 50% acceptance rate. I'm sure I'll get in. But then they apply to something like, computer engineering, which has got a single digit, chance of getting in. And then they're surprised that they didn't
Right.
make it. So it's something that you have to plan for. And of course, the first instinct that a lot of families have is, well, let's apply to the easiest program, and then you get in and you switch your major. And
Yeah,
as you would,
as somebody who went to Carnegie Mellon, that is
oh, there
extremely
you
difficult
go.
to do because people have figured that game out a long time ago.
Exactly. That's that. Well, congratulations on going to Carnegie Mellon. I love that school. Um,
Oh,
so
thank you.
yeah. So yeah, I agree. I mean, they now what they do is they have majors that are called capped majors, meaning they cap the number of students that can be in it. And typically they let the freshmen in. Let's say we can take 100 computer engineering freshmen, and to transfer into that major, one of those 100 people has got to drop out for you to have even a chance, because that's
Right.
their capacity. That's as many as they can take. So, that's not here in North Carolina. NC State is a terrific state school. And for a long time, what people have done is applied to poultry science, because poultry science is statistically the easiest major to get into. So if you want to be a chicken doctor or something to that effect, that's the one for you. But then a lot of people they've since tightened things up, and it's harder to change out of that major. So and I
Yeah,
have a
and then
I,
then you're stuck learning about poultry science,
about poultry
so
science.
it's a little bit of
It's
a
funny.
risk.
I helped a family friend this year apply to NC State, and he came out saying, "Yeah, I want to work in poultry science." I said, "All right, come on, this is not going to work anymore." But it turns out he really does. He spends his summer working on chicken farms and building chicken coops, and he's a country boy and he wants to be a chicken farmer. So
That's so
Godspeed to
funny.
him. Yeah. So
Right.
I got a
Well,
legit
great.
one in there.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I mean, I think that like this is kind of part of the next thing I want to talk about, which is which way the winds are blowing with with the different majors that people can take, right? And I mean, you mentioned
Yeah.
that like computer science is really popular. I mean, I feel like that's probably a pretty big trend. But then within computer science, what are sort of the things that are getting the most attention or where most students are interested in trying to work or learn about?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I went to a national conference a month or two ago in Connecticut for independent educational consultants. And I went to a panel about this, and it was really smart. And the first thing they said is, if your student comes to you and says, I'm interested in computers, that can mean such a wide range of things these days. So,
Hmm.
so you've got computer science, right? But then a lot of kids now are going straight for AI, and colleges are adding AI majors really quickly. And I think quickly to the point where I worry a little bit about the quality control. I've seen some good
Mhm.
schools open AI departments, but I've also seen some very small, little known schools suddenly announce we have this new AI program, and it's it's pretty clearly a marketing device. It doesn't mean it's not a good program, but it's some of them are popping up pretty quickly to be extremely trustworthy,
Mhm.
I think. So
Yeah.
AI, data science, which I think is a great one, and especially for people who are maybe more math people than they are computer people, but they still want to be in the field. Data
Mhm.
science, statistics are both things that math majors can lean on. Um, One of the really interesting things with AI is a lot of people are moving into cognitive science because they want to really
Mhm.
figure out how does machine learning actually work. And in fact, some people are, and this is a little bit controversial, but some people are sort of guessing that people are going to be moving away from coding because your AI now can do a lot of your coding. So what you really need to
Right.
do is learn your cognitive science so that you can write the prompt for the coding in the best way possible so that the AI can actually do what you want it to do.
Yeah. There's a lot of debate about like how that's going to play out and what you should be setting up your kids to do, right? Like, I mean, I've heard some people that have gone the complete opposite direction and said, I'm not having my kids study computer science. I'm having them study philosophy and like
Yeah.
learn critical thinking skills. So
Yeah, well our
it'll be interesting to see kind of like what skills are durable as AI takes over most of the white collar workforce.
That's right. And the thing, as someone who was an English professor for a long time, I had to have a lot of talks with parents about, marketability. And it's a good question. I mean, it's not an English major is not going to immediately get you an $80,000 job, but if you're learning how to read and comprehend and write really carefully, that really does put you in a good position to deal with AI. And as you said, philosophy, I think, it's pretty clear that our technology outstrips our philosophy at this point. So we do need to raise up a generation that has some sort of ethical, philosophical equipment to deal with what's coming. So I don't think that's a
Hmm.
bad thing at all. There, everyone, every couple of years, the media will sort of come out and say soft skills are what we need now, and that's what employers are looking
Hmm.
for. Uh, and I think that probably is true every couple of years, and then it falls off after people discover they're not making a lot of money, and then it comes back up. So
Right.
it's the pendulums always come back.
Yeah, and the pendulum is always, kind of following whatever a lot of people made money on in the last 5 to 10 years,
Right.
which is not necessarily how people will make money in the next 5 to 10 years.
No, and I would tell my English majors often that the job that they're going to have or the career they're going to have has not been probably not been invented yet. And that,
Right.
actually came true for a lot of my English majors back in the early 2000s because they ended up being social media managers. And that was not something
Hmm.
that even existed when they were freshmen.
Right. Exactly. Well, that's all super interesting. I think now I'd love to kind of switch to the next topic that I have on my list here, which is talking about standardized testing.
Yep.
Back in, for those who haven't listened to the other 100 plus episodes on this, back in 2020, basically COVID made it impossible to take standardized tests. So most of the colleges in the United States went to what's called test optional, where people don't have to submit test scores. Now, we're starting to see for the first time, really with like in 2024, we saw it was like Dartmouth, or it was MIT first, and then it was
Right.
Dartmouth, Yale, Brown, then Harvard, I think, followed, now
Harvard.
Stanford. They're all reinstating their test requirements.
Yep.
And I'm just curious, kind of like, what is the thought about this trend, maybe in your, independent education consultant to conference? Like, how are people
Yeah.
talking about it, and how are parents talking about it?
Right. Yeah. So there are two, there are two things that you have to follow in parallel, or two topics you can explore in parallel. One is why did they stop, which you articulated well, which was people couldn't get to testing centers. But the bigger question is, why did they pick it back up? So that's one thread. And then the other thread is, okay, what are you going to do about it if you're a student applying? So the first thing, why did they reinstate it? So there are kind of two basic reasons, and they don't have to necessarily be related. And the first one is just academic. I mean, I was reading Caltech's statement on their website yesterday, and they, Caltech being very techy, they just said, look, this was a data point that once we lost it, we began admitting people that weren't as capable of doing the work. And so for us, this is just a continuation of our mission to, have the student body that's the most appropriate to what we do. And so
Mhm.
I think the blanket answer for that one, the first reason is now people have got enough years of data where they can say, all right, these kids that we let in 2020, how did they do? And they didn't do that well at especially some of the
Right.
top tier schools. So yeah, as you said, these IVs, and I expect more are going to fall back into standardized testing pretty quickly. And then the other reason, which is not necessarily as good a reason, although the effects are kind of the same, is political. Tennessee, Florida, and Georgia, all of those states, their flagship schools have gone back to requiring tests, and in many cases, several of their schools. And this is mostly pressure from their legislatures. I
Mm.
think that they did not want their state to be seen as dumbing down their education or making it, making their schools less competitive. So I think it's, very much an image thing. I know when Georgia went
Mhm.
back, they did it in the middle of an application season. I feel like it was maybe September or October. I could be wrong with that, but it was when my students were already working and on their applications, and we had to suddenly pivot because they didn't give a year. They just said, starting now, we require this again. So
Right.
that
Yeah, they
was,
did. Like it seems like a lot of these universities have actually gone back to requiring tests kind of in a hurry, right? Like even
yeah,
Harvard had originally said we're not going to require tests this year, and then
yeah,
we might do it next year, and then they walked that back and basically were like we're doing it immediately.
yeah. That's
So,
that's one of the
I
things that,
think. Oh yeah, sorry. I was just going to say I think that there are probably people, or probably sorry, like reasons that people are like making these decisions based off of, right?
yeah, absolutely. And you're right. I mean, several. I can look at just this list of Ivies, Yale and Harvard, I think, and maybe Brown, were all schools that said we will not require the test until at least 2026, and then they've just unceremoniously dumped that and gone back to requiring.
Right. Exactly. And I think that it is yeah, indicative that there was like a strong reason to do that, right?
Right, and it's what's interesting is, was the reason coming from outside pressure from state legislatures, or was it coming from inside pressures? Because while I see some unfairness in quickly shifting back to requiring tests, I do think, and I've maybe changed my tune on this a little bit, but I do think that they are something good for the colleges to look at to admit people. One of the
Right.
things that a lot of the schools that have returned to testing have said, and which is true, is that there's so much grade inflation in US high schools that something, half of college bound students have a 4.0 or close to it. And so
Mhm.
if you're an
Yeah,
admissions
it's like
officer at,
47%, I think.
is that what it is? Yeah, that sounds right to me. That's stunning. So if you're an admissions officer at Stanford and you open up your, big bucket of candidates, you're faced with a wall of 4.0s. So if you can't use the grades to make that distinction, and that they're supposed to be holistically evaluating, so I hope they look at everything, your essays and your activities and your recommendations. But what's good about standardized tests is that they're standardized. So, if you and your colleague across the country both have 4.0s, Stanford doesn't know the difference between your high school and that other person's high school. One might be an easy place to get a
Right.
4.0. and one might be terribly difficult. But if you both have a 1500 on your SAT, they know that you have achieved the same thing. And that's, the word standardized carries everything.
Yep.
Interestingly, Yale is going to allow AP and IB exams if you don't want to turn in an SAT or an ACT. And I was talking with a client last night. It's like, well, what if the only AP you took was, AP Bio, and you're great at it, but that's the only score you submit? I mean, that would, if I
Yeah.
were an admissions officer, it'd make it hard for me to decide on that student.
That was me also.
Yeah.
I took the bio SAT too because I didn't know what else to do. And I aced it. Like I got an 800. I have no idea how or if I should
Oh,
have been a
fantastic.
biologist, and I just never followed my calling.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I also wanted to talk about one of the things that I felt like was driving, at least for like the non-political situations.
Yeah.
The only school that actually released their data when they went back from test optional to test required was the University of Texas, Austin. And what
Yep.
they reported was that, their average SAT score for their admitted students with scores was about 1430 or 1450.
Hmm.
The average SAT score for the test optional admits was 1100.
Yep.
And then what they also found was that their freshman year GPA of the test optional students was 0.86 lower than the rest of the student body, basically a full
That's
grade
the
lower.
letter grade. Yeah. I mean, and
Yeah, so
that's
I think
not
that's
as,
definitely like a big academic motivation for these schools to maybe go back to requiring test scores.
yeah. I mean, having taught college, I don't, this is not a personal criticism against them, but having an unprepared student in a class with a lot of prepared students, slows everybody down. And
Mhm.
you're not necessarily, this is something that maybe is a topic for another time, but you know, people get so hung up in my kid has to go to a top 20 school that you
Mhm.
don't stop to think, am I doing that student a disservice by putting them in an atmosphere where they can't really keep up? I
Right.
think there's this perception that if my kid goes to Princeton, then from then on, once they get in, it's, they're not going to flunk out, surely. And not many people flunk out, but I do think that there are people who go there and who are miserable, for sure.
Right.
Um, my
Well, at the
my
end of the day, you are somewhat responsible as the admissions officer, right?
Yeah, but if you don't have the data that you need to make that assessment, then you're really having to fly by the seat of your pants a lot.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, it does come down to data at the end of the day. And I think that was the argument that, Dartmouth,
Yeah,
or maybe I forget which school went first. I think it was Dartmouth,
Dartmouth,
where
I
they
think, was
basically said
first.
like this data gives us the ability to find, the diamonds in the rough that we like are trying to find from these underrepresented minorities and other
Right.
communities. And, when this data is missing, we really, like you said, it's really hard to tell,
Yeah.
who has a 4.0 deservedly
Yeah. And
and
one,
who doesn't, and also how to sort of scale that 4.0 versus other people.
yeah. And one of the things that has been pointed out by lots and lots of people is that if schools had the time and resources, and I'm sympathetic to the schools. I mean, the admission application numbers have gone up so much so quickly that, of course, they don't have time to do everything right. But it has been pointed out that if you look at SAT or ACT scores not as just a number, but a number in the context of, right, that student situation. So if you've got a 1200 and you went to a really classy private boarding school, maybe that doesn't make you Harvard material. It makes you material for a lot of places, but not Harvard. On the other hand, if you got that same score and you're at an underserved school where almost nobody attends college and you have got personal, your family has few resources, then that same 1200 probably means a higher level of achievement. So,
Right.
then you have to make the case, all right, can we let this student in and not that one, even though they've got the same test score? And of course you can, because the test score is not the only thing that you're looking at, but it does make it, you have to be a little bit more nuanced in the way you interpret it.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I also just think that, um, having more points of comparison is better than having less, right? Like
Yeah,
at the end of the day, even if it's not sort of and shouldn't be like the be all end all, it should
right.
be included, or at least sort of the idea, I think, is like by including it, there's an opportunity because you have that extra data point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, there's a good argument to be made that maybe this is more appropriate for elite schools. I mean, if you're Harvard and you have 50,000 applications. On the other hand, if you're, Montana State and you just want to check and
Mhm.
make sure that, the student did good work in high school, I'm not sure that they need to go back to testing. So I think there could, but
Right.
then of course there's a perception that it's a two-tiered system. I know that when some schools went test optional, they continue to require the test for people who are applying for certain scholarships.
Mhm.
So it's almost like it's a higher level sorting device than the one you use for admissions, but you use this for, other things, more rarefied operations.
Yep. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Well, yeah, any other thoughts on just like college admissions trends and kind of anything you want to say before we close this out?
Yeah, I mean, what I my advice to actual actual students with boots on the ground, take the test. I mean, even if right this minute the school you want is test optional, that could change tomorrow. And in a lot of cases this year,
Hmm.
it is going to change. So take the test. If you are a rising junior and not a rising senior, I would say take both an ACT and an SAT, see which one yields you the higher percentile. What are you better at? And
Yep.
then drill down on that one. But you are
Yeah,
the
exactly.
test prep expert, so I'll leave that to you.
Oh yeah, no, I mean I completely agree with you, right? Get a real ACT. You can get old ones pretty easily online,
Yep,
and um, get a real SAT,
yep,
and basically like make sure that you kind of have picked your battle, like which test you want to go for,
right.
and then you should do it because at a minimum it will give you. And I mean, yes, I sell test prep software, but realistically,
Yeah,
like this is what I truly believe. At a minimum, it's like an option to potentially unlock a whole new tier or set of schools if you do really well, first and
yep,
foremost. Second, even if you're, scoring within the range of the school that you want to go to, let's say,
yeah.
and not like way above it, it still can be really meaningful for scholarships,
It
which
can
is a
be.
whole a
Yeah,
whole nother call, a whole nother
that's
podcast that we
another
don't need to
thing.
do right now.
Yeah.
But that's just like there are good reasons to at least give it a good, honest shot.
Yeah.
And like you said, then you'll be kind of prepared for these
Yeah. I mean,
potential,
if they
reversions
pull the,
to requiring tests.
right, if they pull the rug out from under you at the last minute, you'll have something. Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's right. I think that, it's going to be, this is particular is going to be a weird year when schools bring it back because they're, if you go now and you look at what their average SAT is, it's very inflated because only the people
Right.
with high scores are turning in the scores. So their average now might be 1400, but as you said, like with University of Texas at Austin, their real average, like if you made everybody take the test, it might be closer to 1250. So this
Right.
year, when you're facing a 1400 school that was test optional that brings it back, it's going to be hard to know where you stand because you're going to be
Yeah.
comparing your number to a self-selecting number of high scores. But you're going to have, I mean, if
Yeah.
it's required, it's required. So you might as well.
Well, right, exactly. And I mean, it's also like again, it's certainly there's I think plenty of other episodes even on this podcast about sort of the merits and the good
Yeah,
things that your child or you as the kid will learn in this process. But at the end of the day, I really do think it's kind of like a call option on your test taking ability. Like if your test taking ability is
yeah,
really good, it's a really good thing to figure that out, right?
yeah,
And it can
exactly.
really help you. And if it isn't, then you're still back where you're still in the same situation basically that you were already in.
Yeah, and just circling back really quickly to something you mentioned before about the higher score opening doors. I had this week a student, a client who was at a 31 on his ACT, and then he got his latest one back and it went up to 34. So
Nice.
we're going back into his list, and the things that were reaches maybe aren't reaches, and some places we weren't going to apply to, we're going to apply to.
Yeah, very exciting. Well, congrats on
Yeah.
that.
Oh yeah, he's a terrific student, and I'm really happy for him.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This has been Shift, a college admissions podcast for a changing world, hosted by Tyler from Achievable with David Parker from Parker Educational Consulting. And you can get a free trial of Achievable's ACT course by going to achievable.me.